Man, do I love looking up at the stars at night. Back before I had all kinds of responsibility and actually had to kind of grow up, I, being the consummate night owl, used to drive up onto the Blue Ridge Parkway in the middle of the night, and I would stare at the stars for hours. I can't even begin to tell you how many shooting stars I saw in that time period. And even though that was kind of a lonely time in my life, sometimes I do miss just being able to go up there and stare at the sky, knowing that I'm one of the few people on the planet awake and getting to see how beautiful the night is from that vantage point. And if I had grown up maybe just a little bit closer to Brown Mountain down near Morganton in North Carolina, maybe I could have done the same thing, while also keeping an eye out for the Brown Mountain lights. However, I do know somebody that did get to spend a lot of time at night looking at Brown Mountain and putting some serious research time into trying to figure out what was going on with the Brown Mountain lights. And on this episode of Ghosts in the Mountains, we are going to hear all about it in our interview with Dr. Dan Caton. So if you're able to, maybe take a little bit of a night drive up to a beautiful vista, pop that moonroof, and let's see if we can figure out what this thing is all about. Tonight on Ghosts in the Mountains. The Appalachian Mountains are some of the oldest in the world, and we just happen to live in them. One thing we can tell you, there are ghosts in the mountains. Good evening and welcome to another special edition of the Ghosts in the Mountains podcast. I am your host, Caleb Hanks, and with me, as always, the ever-trusty, the wonderful, the wondermous, the magical, Mr. Austin Burgess. Brother man, how are you doing?
I'm doing great tonight, man. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I want to know how you recovered from your, not just your recent illness, but your recent just brain blast of having to learn everything about the history of Brown Mountain.
I kind of had a handicap on this one. So, like we mentioned, this is a subject that had been of personal interest for, both of us for a while. So,
yeah,
I had a handful of independent research already done on this one. So the brain blast wasn't too bad, but I'm definitely glad to be overall the crud, which was really the worst ailment there.
Yeah, you went to Taco Bell and ordered the Mountain Dew Baja Brain Blast. Well, I am incredibly excited because once again, we are covering one of the subjects that is probably the most near and dear to Austin and I and all of our long-winded, long-term, decades-long research into the paranormal. And you and I really got lucky when we were brought into this planet because we basically were just like hatched in the backyard of all the crazy stuff.
Yeah. The more I dig into this, the more I realize Asheville and Western North Carolina itself really is a magnet, a vortex for the weird.
The vortex, they've claimed it to be for a very long time. And this episode is a continuation, if nothing else, if not more, of our deep dive into Brown Mountain. Now, if you have not listened to our episode previous to this one, please hit pause and go back to episode number 9, the Brown Mountain Lights with our interview with Dr. Alan Greenfield, because that is the part 1 to this. This is the part 2 of our Brown Mountain Lights investigation. And it was a wild ride.
Yeah, for sure.
With Dr. Greenfield. There's no doubt about that.
So, yeah, we do plan to pick up kind of where we left off on the history side in part 2. But before we dive back into that, I think kind of a quick recap of what we talked to Dr. Greenfield about would be helpful to the listeners moving forward, and at least to kind of talk about some of these ideas that he presented that we kind of haven't had the time to really discuss amongst ourselves.
Yeah, there was a lot of information put out there in that episode, so yeah, I think it definitely deserves a recap. So let's get into that.
Yeah, I think first of all, what really sparked my interest in something I was completely unfamiliar with was the connection that Dr. Greenfield brought up between Ralph Lael's story and this Venusberg legend. It's pretty interesting how he was able to tie this back to, a legend from European folklore that, probably wasn't predominantly known or studied within the Appalachian region at the time. So he kind of made the equivalent of Lael kind of being a good old boy who, I don't want to say he wasn't well educated, but he probably at least wasn't well studied or well aware of some of these old European folklore stories to be able to relay that into his own contactee story.
Yeah, not impossible, but definitely kind of strange. It certainly seems as though there were some sort of, at least archetypal understandings that he had come across somewhere in his travels. But yeah, kind of interesting, his story there.
Yeah, for sure. I really wasn't familiar with the Venusberg legend itself, so that's definitely an interesting crossover. Another interesting thing that he brought up was some of the government involvement, military involvement specifically around the Brown Mountain area. I think we both heard some of these various conspiracies for over the years of there being some type of military tie-in to Brown Mountain. I think a lot of those kind of feed back into an alleged underground military base or something of the sort. But Dr. Greenfield did talk about how the area was used for training for the Green Berets during kind of the Vietnam War era due to the similarity of the thick overgrowth and some of the terrain there.
Right, yeah. Makes total sense. That area over there by Brown Mountain, the foliage can definitely get intensely dense. So it is kind of bizarre, though, that is just like, who thought to go there? Somebody was like, I don't know, Western North Carolina. That's right. Close enough to Vietnam terrain.
They've got forests there. It's close enough. He also mentioned he had a little bit of a strange encounter with type of figure that, might be associated with what some people think of as a man in black that he describes in that interview. I won't spoil too much there. But then the other thing that I think is worth noting is Dr. Greenfield suggesting something that might be a little controversial, and that's the idea that Brown Mountain might contain some type of portal.
Yeah, and, I very much appreciate the fact that he was able to just definitively get into this is what I think about it. There's a lot of people that, I don't want to just say they're like fence sitters or whatever, but it's kind of hard to be definitive about exactly what is going on when a phenomenon like that is just so bizarre and so amorphous. And I appreciate that he's coming from the background in which he's coming from with, he's looked into the occult and the workings of Aleister Crowley for many, many years. And I assume that some of that stuff is kind of playing into his viewpoint on that.
For sure. And, while it might sound kind of like a science fiction type idea, there's a lot of things we take for granted today, like, quantum mechanics, black holes, and really kind of the idea of multiple dimensions itself that really once seemed completely outlandish. But as science evolves, some of these things that sound strange, start to become a little bit more understood and part of the norm.
Yeah, no doubt.
What we do know is no widely accepted scientific explanation has fully accounted for what the Brown Mountain Lights are, despite being studied for really over a century at this point. So it might be safe to say that going outside the scope of our current understanding of science might be the secret there. So I think we kind of recapped everything we talked to Dr. Greenfield about last week. So with all that in mind, this week we're going to be talking to someone with a pretty much a very different approach to the Brown Mountain Lights, and that's Dr. Dan Caton, who is an astrophysicist and professor at Appalachian State University, and he spent years researching the Brown Mountain Lights from a scientific perspective.
Yeah, Dr. Caton is one of the few people that has actually had the opportunity to dedicate multiple years. I mean, at this point, I don't know if there's anybody that's done more,
I'm sure that, there's certainly people that have done comparable amounts, but if there was a short list of people that have done the most actual field work at Brown Mountain.
Yeah, I think we could confidently say there's no other person that spent as much time or dedicated as much time, especially manually going through these video recordings every single night. Like,
that's some pretty tedious work there and some pretty incredible dedication.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a cool quote in the interview that you'll hear later, but the reason that Dr. Caton attributes the amount of time and the amount of work he's put into this Brown Mountain phenomenon ties back to Carl Sagan, which I thought was kind of cool and interesting from someone with such a scientific perspective and background to tie it back to, kind of another prominent figure in ufology.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you spend that much time looking at the stars, you definitely have to be a Sagan fan.
Yeah, agreed, for sure. So, as we mentioned, this is a really important topic for us. And when we started planning this 2-part series, we really wanted to bring in a full panel of doctors and researchers and experts and compare, the various opinions and theories across the spectrum on the Brown Mountain Lights. Our goal was to really present that full perspective from the purely scientific to deeply esoteric. But after getting our first 2 guests confirmed with Dr. Alan Greenfield and Dr. Dan Caton, it became clear we'd really found the perfect candidates to provide that contrast.
But there was still one doctor that we really, really needed to speak to. And, well, I think it kind of speaks for itself. Tonight, you are going to hear, you heard it here first, what Dr. Stephen Greer thinks about the Brown Mountain Lights.
According to ChatGPT.
Yeah, unfortunately, we couldn't actually get Dr. Greer. He had some prior obligations, but his secretary was nice enough to tell us that he was unable to do the show. But we got the next best thing. We got our little buddy ChatGPT to be able to tell us, a summation essentially of, what maybe Dr. Stephen Greer would think about the Brown Mountain Lights. And, here's what ChatGPT has to say. Based on his broader research and perspectives, he might suggest that such phenomena are manifestations of extraterrestrial intelligence attempting to make contact with humanity. Greer advocates for the idea that many unexplained lights and sightings are not random, but deliberate attempts by non-human intelligences to engage with us. He emphasizes the importance of peaceful and conscious initiatives to establish contact, proposing that these phenomena could be invitations or deeper understanding and communication. I think that ChatGPT summed up what Dr. Greer would probably think about the Brown Mountain Lights pretty good there.
Yeah, I think that's pretty on the nose. I like it. So, as you'll hear in the interview, we had some fun joking around with Dr. Caton about really using ChatGPT to, further understand what it might think about the Brown Mountain Lights, but we thought we would tie in a perspective on what Dr. Stephen Greer might also think, seeing as we couldn't have him join us on the pod this time around. But again, we did tie back to see what ChatGPT itself thought of the Brown Mountain Lights, and it spit back a pretty interesting response. And that response is, that's a tough one. The Brown Mountain Lights are one of those enduring mysteries that seem to defy easy explanation. I think there's probably more than one phenomenon at play, which is why no single explanation has ever fully accounted for them. Personally, I'd lean towards a mix of natural explanations, such as earthquake lights, piezoelectric discharge from stress quartz in the mountain, or even plasma formations, such as ball lightning, mixed with something else that we haven't quite figured out yet. The location itself might act as an area where multiple phenomena overlap. Maybe some sightings are just misidentified distant lights, but there's enough high strangeness in the accounts to make me think it's not just a geological or atmospheric phenomenon. I thought that was pretty deep for ChatGPT. So, anyways, we digress here. We're going to jump back into where we picked up, or where we left off, I should say, in part 1, jumping back to some of the history of the Brown Mountain area and the lights themselves. So in part 1, we covered how the lights kind of went from a local legend to basically this big national mystery, with reports ranging from ghostly apparitions to strange floating orbs. And we also kind of covered how, by the mid-20th century, these lights have started to take on more of a extraterrestrial or UFO association. We discussed Ralph Lael's claims being taken aboard a craft and Paul Rose's makeshift tower that he constructed to see the lights better, which all kind of tied the lights back to some form of consciousness. But one thing we didn't touch on last week was that Brown Mountain was actually mentioned in the files from Project Blue Book, which, if you're not familiar, is the United States Air Force, or was the United States Air Force's official investigation into unidentified flying objects, and that operated from 1952 to 1969. So Brown Mountain was included on the list of reported sightings, and that was actually from a November sighting in 1957. But while the lights were mentioned in the sighting log, the Air Force didn't actually open a full case investigation on them. They likely kind of referenced back to that previous Mansfield report, assuming that they'd already had the conclusion to write that one off.
Yeah. Pretty dope to know that Project Blue Book was toiling around in our backyard.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a little bit deeper connections on that too, but we'll save that one for a future episode there. But if you are interested, the files from Project Blue Book are made available for public research. I think that's been released since sometime in the 1970s, and they're available to dig through various places online. So it was interesting to kind of go through. You could search keywords on that. So it's kind of easy to dig for some of these hotspot locations per se, like such as Brown Mountain. But given the wealth of government documents available online, I also checked with the Black Vault, which is an archive of FOIA obtained materials compiled by someone named John Greedwald Jr. He's done a great job on really compiling various kind of unexplained or not widely covered topics that he's dug through some of these Freedom of Information Act requests to archive and collect information on some of these topics. Widely kind of relates to UFOs, but he covers a lot there. So I figured it was worth a shot to see if the Black Vault had anything on Brown Mountain listed in their archives, and actually found a few things that were fairly interesting, at least. First of all, I found a log of past FOIA requests, one being to the CIA, a request from 2018 pertaining to any information on the Brown Mountain Lights of North Carolina. And I also found an Air Force document that mentions a training mission from 1969 where an aircraft wing clipped the ridge of Brown Mountain, which led to an emergency landing at the Hickory Municipal Airport.
Oh, man. We have a little bit of a history of that going on, because it wasn't too long ago that they had to land a plane, an emergency landing on Interstate 26, which is notoriously known for being horrible. And that's when they're not landing planes on it.
Right. Yeah, so that was a little bit of an interesting thing of note there. So in an attempt to kind of learn more about these, I went and I filed my own FOIA request for these topics with CIA and Air Force respectively. So really, in the grand scheme of these departments, these probably seemed like pretty dumb and insignificant requests. So I appreciate the time and effort that both departments took to respond to me on these.
Look at you putting the American taxpayer dollars to work.
It is the freedom of information, after all. So Stephen Glenn with the CIA responded and told me that the original requester from 2018, basically they responded to him and said that the records requested did not constitute agency records that were subject to FOIA. And they also added that based on their knowledge of the record systems, CIA didn't maintain any of the types of records that were requested specific to Brown Mountain. So therefore determined that the CIA didn't have any of the records responsive to this request. So kind of a dead end there, but Christopher Wheaton from the Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico did send me a packet containing a thick, extensive 88-page incident report from the training mission that was referenced in the previous document that I found. So there's really a lot to unpack on those documents, and chunks of them are still redacted for what I assume is privacy reasons. People involved in that incident could still be alive today. So, I understand that a lot of those chunks were probably nothing super secretive and probably more so just to protect identities.
And that's Christopher Wheaton, not Will Wheaton, as in Wesley from the Star Trek.
Yeah, not Wesley Crusher, sorry.
Okay.
Christopher, but maybe there's a relation. I'm not too sure there.
You never know.
So anyways, the gist of this report is that the pilot and the crew claimed there was a malfunction in their navigation gear, including their compass and radar, that led to the aircraft basically descending to such a low altitude it was able to graze the trees on the ridge there. So after post-flight inspection, Air Force technicians actually concluded that the radar system was working perfectly fine within parameters when it was checked after that incident. And the incident report kind of goes on to blame the aircraft crew as the primary cause, and it cites an improper use or training of the radar equipment and a lack of crew integrity, which, seems a little harsh, especially for them to, blame this incident on the crew when it's the same crew that was basically able to land the plane despite the multiple engine shutdowns after the incident. So
yeah, don't know much about that, but I kind of have heard it's a little tough.
Yeah, so I think the most interesting part of this report to me is this incident happened and this alleged malfunction happened right over Brown Mountain. So, was it just a case of pilot error, or, was there something that was going on in the atmosphere with maybe in the electromagnetic field in that area that caused some of that equipment to malfunction in that particular spot? I don't know. There's more theories on that we're going to explore later, but at the very fact, the reported malfunction that happened here is a pretty interesting coincidence, to say the least.
Yeah, there's been so many different theories about the heightened electromagnetic, activity in that realm to begin with. So it's like definitely lends to the idea of it, if nothing else.
Yeah, for sure. And, I again, might have seemed like an insignificant request, but I feel like it might have provided a little bit more context to this Brown Mountain mystery. So cool to be able to dig something like that up and bring to the discussion with that.
Sure. Yeah. Freaky, man.
Yeah. It's very interesting, to say the least. Which, kind of leads to the next, what I would say is bit of government involvement or really investigations of the Brown Mountain Lights from a scientific standpoint. And this investigation came from researchers at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. So for those unfamiliar, Oak Ridge is a federal research facility that's located in Tennessee and operated by the United States Department of Energy.
And Dr. Manhattan may or may not live there.
Yeah. So it really is best known for its role in the Manhattan projects and, later contributions to physics, nuclear energy, atmospheric studies in general. So, it's got a pretty significant history within this pocket of scientific studies.
It also, for the most part, and maybe I'm misrepresenting this, but I think that it's outside of a couple of instances. I can't remember. I mean, I don't want to try to tie this into any sort of like haunting necessarily, but I do know that there have been, if not deaths, there was at least a couple of instances where some people were exposed to some pretty intense radiation when they were putting the place together.
Oh man, I could imagine.
So that might be something that we look into later on, because Oak Ridge in general is just a really strange place. And maybe you're about to go into some of this, but
I mean, I don't go too much into the background on this, but I think this is valuable context to provide the listeners.
Well, speaking of lights hovering in the sky, people have seen a little bit of that over Oak Ridge, if you've heard of that before.
So, given that, I think it's pretty interesting that these high-level scientists from Oak Ridge dedicated the amount of time to studying the Brown Mountain Lights that they did, especially seeing, there's some similarities to occurrences going on in their own backyard.
Oh, yeah. Who knows? Is Brown Mountain nuclear? I think there'd be a lot less trees.
Yeah. I think, and who knows? I mean, I feel like Oak Ridge, with their speciality in that field, might have been able to determine something by then, but we don't really know. I think a lot of their findings were not exactly publicly released.
Yeah, and I might know a little bit about that a little later on in the show that I can touch on. I might have been poking around down there a couple of times and taking a couple of meters, but I digress.
Nice. So these Oak Ridge investigations, they took place basically throughout the late 1970s and basically going throughout the 1980s. I think it concluded in 1988, if I'm not mistaken. And as I mentioned, the full extent of their research remains somewhat elusive. We do know that they were interested in determining whether the lights had a natural geophysical explanation. So they were specifically exploring the possibility that the lights could be caused by some form of natural radiation or plasma discharge or just unusual atmospheric phenomenon in general. So this kind of aligns with a lot of other scientific theories that have been proposed throughout the years. And, as we kind of teased, we'll get into more of that here shortly. But, I think Oak Ridge, for the time, did deploy a lot of specialized detection equipment. And keep in mind the time frame I mentioned, this is late 70s into the late 80s. I think that equipment's definitely evolved over the years, but for the time they were using, equipment to detect for electromagnetic anomalies, for radiation fluctuations, and any other potential triggers that might somehow associate back to the lights. And, while these findings weren't really publicized, the general consensus is that they didn't really have a definitive conclusion to anything. But it's still worth noting that high-level government research really took place, and they thought that the area was warranted enough to study and further investigate. So I think that's definitely of note.
Yeah, I mean, significant enough for a government entity, essentially, to investigate the lights, enough reports. That's honestly pretty wild.
Yeah, especially a government entity that's tied to, some major energy projects and really tied back to the Department of Energy itself. So, maybe I mentioned I did those FOIA requests. Those were prior from my own independent research, but, after, learning more about Oak Ridge itself, and in hindsight, maybe it's the Department of Energy we should be FOIAing to learn more about what some of those investigations and conclusions might have been.
Yeah, I kind of feel like we'd get a lot of redacted stuff back, or just a big nothing burger. But hey, it's worth the shot. Not every FOIA request comes back fruitless.
Yeah, for sure. And the tie back to Department of Energy is kind of interesting in itself, and really not to get too conspiratorial here, but isn't that really exactly what UAP whistleblower David Grush said when he was speaking to Congress? It's go to the Department of Energy.
Well, I tell you what, we'll just put a call to arms out there. If you or anyone has worked at the Oak Ridge facility and potentially might know something about this and would want to talk to two old aging punk rockers that are really into ghosts and weird stuff, send them on over to ghostinthemountans.com.
That's our first ad for the show. We are running ads now, people.
There you go. Hey, we're not sponsored. By the way, if anyone wants to sponsor ghostinthemountans.com, please, for the love of God, help us.
So, for better or for worse, the Brown Mountain Lights really became more entangled with that UFO sensation and some of these government conspiracy theories, especially after Oak Ridge's presence in the area. Kind of the idea that there was a top-tier government research facility that was investigating the lights really added some fuel to that fire that something bigger was going on at Brown Mountain.
Yeah.
Whether it was, classified technology or just an undiscovered natural phenomenon, or maybe in something otherworldly, just the unknown mystery or the idea of the mystery was intriguing to continue to draw people over there over time and to allow that legend to really organically grow. Over time, Brown Mountain and Brown Mountain Lights have become pretty much a pop cultural staple. They've made their way into TV shows from X-Files to Ancient Aliens.
Yeah, Dr. Greenfield saw that episode.
Yeah.
I went for the longest time without watching the X-Files until just a couple of years ago, and man, I loved that show, and I was really surprised, because I never knew they did an episode about Brown Mountain, so I was very surprised to see that they had actually, done one.
Yeah, and it's they have quite a different theory than most people, but definitely makes for an entertaining half hour there.
Yeah, I can't hardly remember how exactly the plot goes, but I know they end up in some caves and some weird stuff.
Yeah, I think it's something about mushrooms are emitting some type of toxic gas that's making them hallucinate and basically hallucinate seeing the lights themselves, from what I understood. Well, been a while since I've seen that one, but that's the general gist that I remember.
I'm not going to say that hallucinogenic mushrooms are not contributing to people seeing things here in the mountains of Appalachia.
Yeah, that's definitely a cause that can be attributed back to some of these, at the very least. So
don't do drugs, kids.
So as the legend of the Brown Mountain Lights continued to grow, so did the number of researchers attempting to unravel this mystery. And by the mid to late 1990s, sometime in that time frame, a new wave of investigators had stepped in to take a fresh look at this. And among them was the aforementioned on this pod, Joshua P. Warren and his team of lemurs.
His team of lemurs that live in Warren's web.
No, the lemur team, we're on episode 10, but if you haven't caught on by now, lemur stands for, Caleb?
The League of Energy Materialization and Unexplained Phenomena Research with a silent P.
There we go.
Yes!
So they launched their own extensive study into the lights, and Warren became really pretty much one of the most vocal researchers on the subject for that time period in the 90s. He published the Brown Mountain Lights Viewing Guide, which helps curious onlookers find the best spots or time of years to look for the lights. And to this day, he continues to maintain brownmountainlights.com, which is a dedicated resource for information and updates on the mystery. So with Warren and Lemur's involvement, the investigation into the lights entered a new era, one that blended scientific research with the world of the paranormal. And in fact, to this day, if you go to brownmountainlights.com, you could find a picture of the young Hanks brothers on one of these investigations.
Yes, you see a very baby-faced version of the young Hanks brothers on a beautiful fall day on Brown Mountain, and we'll get into it a little bit later on, but I have some very, very fond memories of that expedition because, we were given access to the access roads that went all down through there, that some were blocked off to be able to go as far back in there as we could. And I don't think there's a lot of people that really tend to get to do that. So
yeah, this fits right in the timeline. Who better to explain some of these lemur investigations than someone that was there firsthand?
Oh yeah, I can definitely get into it. So we spent a weekend. I want to say that it was, I'm sure it's on the website somewhere, but it was either very late September or early October that we were there. And we camped for 2 nights And we did essentially a full-scale investigation. We didn't have just the lemur team. We had quite a few other people that had come on different paranormal investigations with the lemur team. And we had a fairly large crew with us, but we took as many Geiger counters and things of the like, apparatus that would essentially measure electromagnetic fields, some of the things that Dr. Caton will go into a little bit, and some of the reasons that he didn't think that these were maybe the best methods. But I think that given what we were looking for, we were doing the best we could with what we had.
Hey, I mean, I understand, coming from the background that Dr. Caton does, he probably understands the broader scientific applications of some of these tools. So he might see it from a different point of view, but I totally get it. You're looking for different points of data collection, and that's what all these tools were providing for you.
Yeah, exactly. And something that you and I have kind of touched on, you and I and people like Joshua P. Warren are obviously not scientists, but, the collection of data in kind of a wide sweep is essentially what we would always try to do. We would try to take out as many things that we could that would collect data and do that very thing. And long story short, while we were down there, we had, many instances in the evenings where we just were for hours just looking at the sky and seeing if we were picking up anything, temperature fluctuations, anything of the like. And for the most part, as far as I was concerned, there were certainly some readings that were maybe relatively noteworthy. But after the investigation, Josh put together his report of the findings, and kind of the theory that he came to was that he essentially believes that there is an abundance of quartz and magnetite in the mountain that is being charged by springs underneath the ground, and that charge of those specific capacitors and conductors of electricity were then at certain points of the day when the mountain would expand and contract due to, just temperature changes, that was kind of squeezing the mountain and then also compacting this electromagnetic release that was being built up in the quartz, and then would essentially release like a contained plasma that would then release into the air and hover and glow until it dispersed. And essentially, whether it was ball lightning or a phenomenon that was ball lightning adjacent, that was never really completely determined. But that was kind of the overall gist of like where Warren's mindset was. And I was 16 years old at the time that we did this investigation. I was very, very young, and I didn't know, as they say down in the South here, shit from apple butter about that stuff. And at this point in my life, I still don't really. I didn't go to school for science. I didn't really go to school for anything. I went to the school of hard knocks to learn how to play music. But from at least my viewpoint back then, when I would be talking with Warren, I was like, oh yeah, sure, that all makes sense. And I think one of the reasons that Josh kind of got into this idea of this contained plasma thing was he was friends with a scientist that lived here in Western North Carolina that did all kinds of really interesting electromagnetic studies named Charles Yost. And the two of them linked up, and they would do all kinds of different stuff. There's a study that was, it's probably still on the old Lemur website, but essentially Josh and the Lemur team, I wasn't present for this specific thing. This might have happened before I got in the team, or I was just out playing a show or something when they did this specific scientific experiment. But Dr. Yost made a vacuum chamber in his laboratory that they essentially were able to make a free-floating plasma that lived within this vacuum chamber, because they were trying to essentially recreate what they thought the Brown Mountain Lights were. And there's some video footage of that, I believe, still on the website. But nonetheless, whether that is equated to what the Brown Mountain Lights may or may not be is irrelevant, because that science experiment, if nothing else, was really, really cool to see, because it's not every day that you see some like free-floating plasma in a vacuum chamber like that.
For sure. And I think some people, might chalk some of Warren's theories and ideas up to pseudoscience, but I feel like that's about as most scientific of a, testing of a hypothesis as you could do by creating something like that.
Yeah, and I think the other side of it too was, I think Warren certainly was very scientific-minded about the ways that he tried to apply logic and the science he did understand to the Brown Mountain Lights phenomenon. But I think it was a smart move to align himself with somebody like Yost that had been studying, electrostatics for years and had a background in this stuff.
Yeah, he could provide a different perspective for sure.
And also just like how oddly lucky that Yost would just end up there kind of near where Warren was, you know?
Yeah. Right place at the right time.
So yeah, just in conclusion, that's kind of where Lemur was, but I just have to say the nostalgia of thinking back to those times is really awesome though.
I could only imagine. So shortly after Lemur began their investigation, Dr. Dan Caton, as we previously mentioned, an astronomy physics professor from the nearby App State University, began his own kind of take on an investigation of the lights. And we won't get too much into this because Dr. Caton really does a great job explaining in depth what he's been doing to study this over the past, couple decades, really. But, we will mention that he used really a variety of different cameras and equipments to try to capture the lights under various conditions and is really notable for that rigorous methodology that he's really spent dedicating time to separate the myth from reality on this.
Yeah, we'll definitely let Dr. Caton kind of tell you a little bit more, but the fact that he went to the trouble of setting up multiple cameras to be able to watch Broughton Mountain, just hours worth of footage, I don't really know of anybody else that's put that much effort into that thing.
I don't think there can be.
Yeah.
I feel confident in saying that there is no other person that has put in the amount of time studying this than Dr. Caton has.
That is until we befriend some people that live around Brown Mountain and we throw them some money to keep a camera hooked up to their Wi-Fi all the time.
Well, I think Dr. Caton kind of alluded to his time studying this and the cameras have been taken down now. So it definitely opens it up. But I do feel, as we touch on in that interview, there's probably some technology that's come out in the past 10 or so years that'll make that a little bit less tedious of a task. I think specifically jumping back to the late, great Christopher O'Brien, he was part of developing a technology called UFODAP, which is basically an advanced camera system that works on one of these AI-type recording softwares to eliminate stagnant images and really only show you the frames with some type of movement in it. And on the website listed, before he passed, he actually had a list of potential future sites that he wanted to take the technology to. Brown Mountain was listed as one of them.
There you go.
Hey, maybe a potential project for the future for us.
Yeah, that or we somehow hack all the satellites and watch it from space.
Elon's going to hear this. Anyways, so alongside Dr. Caton's scientific approach, local photographer Charles Broswell also began his own investigation into the Brown Mountain lights roughly around that same time, kind of in the late 90s. And Charles had lived in the area for many, many years, and he was fascinated by the mystery since he was a little kid. So using his photography skills, Charles managed to capture several images of the lights from the 181 overlook. And his photos, he published those in a book that he wrote called Are Those the Brown Mountain Lights? And it provided pretty unique visual record of the lights from a bit of a kind of time-lapse perspective, so you could see the movement of the lights in that still image, or the movement the lights kind of traveled along at least. The book also contained photographs of the alleged alien mummy from Ralph Lale. A little bit more photographic documentation of that. That photo was actually taken by Charles's mother during a visit to Lale's outer space rock shop when Charles was just a child. So this connection to Lale's story alongside Braswell's explanation of the lights makes the book a pretty great resource for photographic documentation of this local lore.
I've decided that every single time that we reference Ralph Lale's alien mummy on this show, I'm going to edit in the dun, dun, dun. Yeah, I mean, I have to say that Ralph Lale's alien mummy brings me a lot up happiness.
I'm glad to see that a lot of other people felt that way too.
I agree.
I love Greenfield's story talking about just like what other ufologist was there at the time that had studied some of these ancient mummies over there. And he's like, oh, yep, that's exactly what this is.
Yeah.
So they didn't even buy it at the time.
Nope.
But, despite these decades of research, the Brown Mountain lights really continue to defy explanation. From scientists and photographers to curious locals and dedicated paranormal investigators, there have been many people that have attempted to uncover the truth behind the lights, but the mystery still persists. Whether they're natural, supernatural, or something else entirely, the lights kind of remain this enduring source of fascination for both residents and visitors to the area to go attempt to see.
And those people might just be us fairly soon.
Hey, yeah, I'm totally down for it. So we said it here. Caleb and I definitely plan to continue our own investigation in this area and the lights specifically, exploring some new theories and, gathering whatever new evidence we can. But I will say in recent years, there has been one video that I think is the most significant development on the Brown Mountain Lights, and that came from Joe and Jesse Lee of the Hellbent Holler crew, who captured a pretty compelling video of February 2023. They got, high quality footage of what many believe, and I think due to description, I would consider to be the Brown Mountain Lights footage from Wiseman's View.
Yeah, and that footage is still currently on YouTube, correct?
Yeah, correct. Footage was taken on a full moon night, and it really provides the clearest visual documentation of the lights to date, which I think really reignited the interest for me personally in the Brown Mountain Lights and kind of led to sparking new discussions about their origins.
Yeah, buddy, you ain't kidding about that being some of the clearest footage. Micah brought this video to my attention for the first time, and there are not a ton of Brown Mountain Light videos that I see where I'm like, well, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And this one, pretty much right off the bat, I tend to classify it as probably the best and most anomalous looking light above Brown Mountain on video that I have ever seen to date. It is very strange.
It's compelling for sure. And, interesting to say, I think there's some other, maybe common factors that could be taken from that video and applied to future research. So we'll dig into that a little bit here in the future. But I will say, as, technology improves and more investigators turn their attention to Brown Mountain, perhaps we're closer to discovering the truth behind this mystery than we might think.
Well, I know a way that we could potentially figure it out in one night.
Oh.
We do a Brown Mountain 181 overlook, Ghosts in the Mountains meetup.
Hey, I think that's the best way to do it. You got to have people from multiple vantage points to kind of corroborate what you're seeing, to validate or invalidate lights that might be from campers, from airplanes, from ATVs.
Well, one thing that we used to do when we were investigating it with the Lemur team is we would have A, B, and C team. One would be at 181, one would be at the top of Table Rock, and then one would be down at Wiseman's View. You have everybody on walkie-talkies, and then you have everybody essentially being able to see from different perspectives in line of sight, and then everybody's got cameras. I think camera quality and the ability, obviously, to share video and things like that is so much better now than it ever was back then. I don't know if there's been any large-scale coordinated efforts like this done in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I really don't know, but I think that's a great idea to try to coordinate something like that. And, we could potentially use some sort of radio communication would probably be best for areas a little bit spotty in cell service around there. But, I think there's some good ideas and probably new equipment we could test out. Is that area a no-fly zone for drones? Some of those areas are protected from...
That I don't know. One thing that I do think would be really interesting to implement is, and this was something that I was going to pick up for some of our ghost research, was I was showing you just a little while ago, they're the little FLIR clip-ons that plug directly to the bottom of your phone. That's a USB connection, and it essentially turns your smartphone into a thermal camera. I think we talked about this on the Smith McDowell episode, where the actual thermal imaging FLIR cameras, those cameras back in the day were incredibly expensive.
Yeah,
and
understandable.
You can get one of these little things that snaps into your phone for a little over $200, I believe. So I would love to be able to take some of that down there, because that is one piece of equipment that I literally have never been able to take down there. Now, I think I explained on the episode with Dr. Greenfield that I have been able to, from Wiseman's View, look at the gorge through some pretty high quality actual night vision goggles, and pardon the pun, but it was very illuminating. To be able to see not just things that would potentially be anomalous light sources, but to be able to even better see the things that are known and recognize in that light space, like what kind of ambient light those things are taking up. But that's just another reason. Before we go for our Lake Lure investigation, the Lake Lure Inn, I'm going to pick up one of those thermal imaging things. Would love to take that thing up to the Grove Park Inn sometime. But Brown Mountain Lights, that's a prime area to be able to use that sort of stuff.
For sure. Especially, theoretically, if it is some sort of ball lightning type phenomenon, you would think there's a bit of a heat signature attached to that. So definitely interesting to explore that possibility.
Yeah, and especially when, it's relatively expensive, but it's not, breaking the bank, so why not?
And if it's something that has, multiple applications, multiple uses that we'll be able to utilize a few times on future investigations.
We'll put it to use. I'll burn through a few phones.
So, as we mentioned, I think there's kind of a wide range of theories about the origins of these lights. They've ranged from ones that are really rooted in science to ones that are rooted more on the folklore or really paranormal side of things. So, I think as we're wrapping this up, let's kind of dive into some of these popular theories and talk about how it could be plausible or how it could be written off. Because I think that when you look into most of these, there is a point-counterpoint to most of these that almost disproves them in some way to lead to this phenomenon still kind of being unexplained to this day.
Yeah, let's get into it, man.
Yeah, so, I think starting off with some of the plasma discharges, I think that's one of the most common ones, and especially since we just talked about that with the lemur team, I think that's really a pretty compelling theory that I've seen crossover with, across many different scientific minds that have studied this phenomenon as well.
Yeah, and I mean, if the lemur team didn't necessarily hit the nail on the head with it, I do respect the fact that we got as close as we possibly could. And I think that the basis of the theory that the lemur team essentially landed on, I think that there's still merit to the ideas that are going there. Because if you take out the specifics of the ideas of the quartz and the magnetite being charged by the underground springs and that sort of thing, but you look at the idea in general of this is potentially a plasma phenomenon that if it isn't ball lightning, it could be similar to ball lightning. Now, Alan Greenfield, we've been doing a lot of interviews lately, so I'm getting it all mixed up. But we go into some other known atmospheric anomalies that only in the last couple of years have really been paid attention to. That Dr. Caton is going to elaborate on a little bit more in his interview. But, when you think about atmospheric phenomenon, lightning in general does some, as far as like movement goes, it does some pretty erratic things. And we know for a fact that lightning can take multiple different forms. And the idea that if it is ball lightning, and ball lightning being an incredibly rare phenomenon, but somehow maybe Brown Mountain there is some sort of geological something going on there that is, essentially making the atmosphere rich for that phenomenon to occur.
Yeah.
That in itself is an anomalous occurrence. And that,
sure.
Still might not be the case, but either way,
Yeah. And I mean, I think the main thing that really kind of works against this plasma theory is we just don't know enough about it. There's no direct scientific correlation that can be made to really determine that this is how something like this is created. This is the origin of something like this that could be attributed back to the lights. And I think that definitely leaves the possibility, if that theory is still open, when you're only able to kind of, I won't say write it off, but almost like not grasp or reach that as your final conclusion, is because there's just not enough known about that phenomenon currently.
Yeah, and I want to take the time right now to just make it very clear. Like, having back-to-back episodes with Alan Greenfield and Dan Caton, by no stretch of the imagination are we like pitting these two people's opinions against each other. We are trying, Austin and I are trying to learn as much about these things as we can. And we wanted to find two people from two very different backgrounds that had spent time checking this stuff out. Dr. Greenfield being there from the early days of ufology and starting to look into this stuff. And then Dr. Caton, who comes from a very, very, I would say, staunch scientific background, and he's applied that mindset to the phenomenon. I find both of their opinions incredibly interesting. And I think that after speaking with both of them, I think just for the sake of my enjoyment and the thing that we talk about a lot here on the podcast, the enrichment of the lore, I think I want to stay somewhere kind of firmly in the middle of it, because I think my whole standpoint is I don't know what the hell's happening down there.
Yeah, and we'll touch on some personal theories or maybe even just personal opinions at the end here. But, I do like that stance of like hearing both sides of the spectrum and the argument and, seeing merit in both sides and meeting somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and two people that are incredibly knowledgeable and both well-spoken about their standpoint on the issue. It was incredible to be able to talk to both of them.
So yeah, I think this next theory really kind of ties into some of the stuff that Lemur was proposing, and that's the piezoelectric effect, which is really the energy release caused from quartz, as you mentioned. Some of the shifting that happens among these formations creates bursts of energy that can sometimes manifest as glowing lights, which, I think the most common application of this is being back in Boy Scouts, seeing people rubbing two sticks, striking two stones together, trying to create that spark that could create your campfire from there.
Yeah, sparking the flint.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's in a nutshell what this piezoelectric effect is. And I think the reason this is somewhat written off in times is that's basically just that, a flash, a spark in the air, where the lights have been described quite differently. So
yeah, because I think in almost every instance, I think I've heard some stories for sure where the lights stayed there for quite some time.
Yeah.
But I would say even in the longer sightings of the Brown Mountain Lights, it's typically not very long that people see these.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think what they say 30 seconds to a minute. It's about the average time frame, and then they'll kind of float off or dissipate from there.
Yeah, I mean, any illuminations, and again, I still don't know that if I've seen illuminations. I don't know if I've ever seen the Brown Mountain Lights, but any illuminations that I've ever witnessed lasted seconds.
Yeah, about the same here. I think earthquake lights is another kind of theory that really goes hand in hand with that piezoelectric theory, basically being the same thing, only a little bit more seismic activity is attributed to some of these. There are fault lines that run through that area pretty significantly, but I think the argument to be made is you look at some of these fault lines, namely the Brevard Fault, which goes through a large chunk of western North Carolina, kind of at a diagonal stretch. If that really is the cause, why is it this one specific area that's experiencing the lights as opposed to all areas throughout the stretch of the fault?
Well, there's obviously not any kind of eruption happening, but I tell you what, whenever you look at the lightning craziness that happens when a volcano is going off in those big clouds, it's like, well, if there is tectonic fault activity, then I wouldn't be surprised, because that stuff's nuts.
Yeah, for sure. And I do think that is a pretty fascinating theory. I think there's a lot of people that maybe fall more on the pseudoscientific or paranormal study side that have drawn a bit of a correlation between some of these paranormal encounters, be it ghostly spirits, UFO sightings, and areas that are basically known for a bit of seismic tectonic activity, which, basically occurs along a lot of these fault lines.
Yeah. And, I still don't hate the idea that these are ghostly phenomenon. I don't always entertain that idea, but I'm not going to completely write it off.
Yeah, for sure. Again, keeping all possibilities open.
Yeah.
The other one I think is the probably more humorous one at this point, has ties back to some Project Blue Book explanations, and that is swamp gas. So,
yep.
I was actually surprised to hear Dr. Caton briefly mention this in the interview, that there are small little pockets on the mountain where swamp gas can be found in some of those wetland areas, but he said we'll let him explain, but it's basically insignificant amounts that wouldn't attribute to the lights.
Well, I know an even weirder theory that ties into that.
What's that?
Are you ready for this, dude?
I'm ready.
All right. I hope you are ready, because this is some deep lore, bro.
Does this have to do with bugs or worms or something of the sort?
Buddy, buckle up.
Okay.
So, I'm not going to name names, but it was Joshua P. Warren that told me this. And Josh told me that he had run into somebody that told him that he knew exactly what the cause of the Brown Mountain Lights were.
Oh.
And the cause of the Brown Mountain Lights were deep within the tunnels and caves that go underneath the mountain are these little worms. And the little worms have little flames on their butts, like a Charmander.
Like an actual flame.
Yeah, like an actual flame, like an actual fire.
Okay. Not just a red design or red marking,
No.
fully burning tail.
Fully burning tail. We're talking actual Pokemon here, man.
Wormander.
And the Wormander, I think, now, I'll have to get Warren to come on the podcast to clarify, because I'm probably butchering the exact thing. But what I understood was that Wormander and all the other little Wormmanders would put their butts together, and then the flames from their worm butts would get hit by the swamp gas, and then it would form a ball and fly and burn up into the night sky. Now, I don't know. I think that's my favorite theory so far. I think I buy that one.
I think I have heard this story. I think it goes a little bit farther. Doesn't the guy who told Warren this tell some story of exploring into the caves of Brown Mountain and finding all these worms like clumped together in some huge mass ball in one of these caves.
Like a rat king.
Yeah.
That's how he knew about the worms, man. He saw them himself.
And there's some parallels to old Ralph's story there too as well.
See, I love that story because it's so crazy. And but it's like, what if that one ends up being the one?
Right? New species discovered. And then everyone's just like,
oh God, it was this the whole time. The weirdest one, it was this one. But that comes back to the Boojum stuff. Like, yeah, do I think it's worms with flame butts? No. Do I think a worm with a flame butt exists? Probably not. I mean, nature gets pretty weird. However, do I like that story? A whole bunch. Yeah, I really do.
I want that story to be true.
In fact, we might have to make a Wormander t-shirt.
Yes. Oh, man. That's a great one. I actually do enjoy that theory quite a bit.
I'm so sorry, listeners. I also know that I don't add anything to this conversation. So
no, I mean, I actually had that on my list. And, I think some of those bioluminescent insects, blue fireflies, blue ghost fireflies is another thing that can be somewhat attributed to that. I think that kind of ties hand in hand with the worms because, have you seen the blue ghost fireflies before?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, you're talking about this. The blue ghost fireflies may be the thing that inspired that whole idea because the blue ghost fireflies only occur in very specific parts of the world, and Western North Carolina just happens to be one of those. And I think I told you a little while back, I'm not going to disclose this because I don't want people swamping the place, but we have a friend go down to, he's a big piece of property around here in Western North Carolina. That's all I'm going to say, but very good friend. I've known this guy forever. And the bro and I are down there just hanging out, having a bonfire, drinking a couple of beers, catching up with everybody. And the bro goes into the woods and he sees these dim little lights that are hovering over the ground. And he comes barreling ass out of the woods. And he was like, dude, he's like, the blue ghost fireflies are here. I had never seen them. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the areas that are typically for tourists to go see the blue ghost fireflies, is that not still on a lottery system that you essentially have to like get lucky to get a ticket to be able to witness?
I'm not sure on certain areas. I know there are areas within the Pisgah and really kind of up along the parkway that are common viewing places for them. I feel like I
think it's just a concentrated area that they do a lottery for it.
Probably so. That probably is it. I know kind of that pink bed through kind of the Craggy Gardens area have been common.
But they're still rare enough of an insect to where, I mean,
exactly.
There's a lot of people coming to check them out. And
if you've never seen that before, you're going to think you're seeing something weird.
They look very, very different from the way that, typical fireflies look. You'll kind of know what you're seeing after a minute because they do hover very, very low to the ground. Mm-hmm. And the light that they emit does not blink on and off like typical fireflies. It stays at a very dull, constant light. And I wouldn't necessarily say that it's like a blue color. It's more like a dim yellow.
Yeah.
But yeah, still very, very strange. Yeah. So, this being this rare bug that is really only seen in this region and then a few other places on the planet, I see exactly how that could be the correlation of that story.
For sure. I think another widely accepted theory suggests that the lights are some sort of mirage effect caused by whether it's temperature inversions or some sort of atmospheric sensation that cause a bit of a refraction of the lights, kind of bending the lights that are seen from either distant cars or trains or campfires into some of these floating orbs that people witness.
All right, Blue Book. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, I think if that's the case, this should be a pretty easily replicable theory, in practice.
What I will say is I was just listening to a more recent interview with Jacques Vallée just last night. And he was kind of talking about some of these instances where people were potentially seeing what they saw as or interpreted as saucer-shaped things, but these actually were atmospheric refractions of different things, sunlight, all kinds of different stuff. I mean, things like that do happen. I don't write stuff like that off because to me, a vast majority of the time, the more common explanation typically is the explanation.
Yeah, understood. I just think that this hasn't become a widely accepted theory because
I agree.
In practice, if that's the case, there should have been enough, bright scientific minds that would be able to replicate this.
Absolutely, yeah.
But again, who knows? One of the other kind of more interesting ones is foxfire, which is, going back to some of the bioluminescent stuff, it's basically bioluminescent mushrooms.
Oh, yeah.
fungi to an extent.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of produced a faint greenish blue glow. But again, I think that there's been enough study on this to sort of debunk that as a potential explanation for the lights.
Yeah, I mean, like, I grew up in the woods around here, and I don't know if there's like a vast difference in the foliage down that way, but I, to my knowledge, have never witnessed a bioluminescent mushroom.
Yeah, and I think the glow from that, as I mentioned, it's faint. It's not going to be as described as some of these bright glowing orbs that could be easily confused with brown mountain lights. So, interesting theory, could have some merit. Maybe it ties into some of these bioluminescent insects or worms, as we mentioned, but who knows? It's still interesting that all these possible theories have been dug into, and it's really, exploring all possible angles, it feels like. And really kind of tying back to plasma, I think really one of the more common and more widely accepted at this point is really the ball lightning phenomenon, which really ties into plasma itself. And I think that there's various people, as you mentioned, between the Lemur team and Dr. Caton himself, who think that this theory has some merit. But again, this is such a rare phenomenon that there isn't enough scientific study to really validate this as the cause of the lights.
Unfortunately so. And that's another thing with the ball lightning phenomenon. There's barely footage of it because it happens so erratically and so just out of nowhere. Your best case of catching that is you just happen to have the camera running.
Yeah, no joke. So, if there is some correlation between that and the Brown Mountain lights, I think it's still extremely exciting that it could be on the verge of some topic within the scientific world that we don't know a lot about, which could lead to future, discoveries being tied to that.
That's true. And then we'll harness it and try to figure out how to turn it into a weapon like they've basically...
I'm pretty sure Oak Ridge was trying that for the 10 years they were down in the area.
I don't know. Let's open this file back up.
Yeah, right. So, I think there's other man-made explanations, common misidentification to the lights from distant car headlights to plane lights, train lights, or, ones that are more on the ridge, campfires, even lanterns and flashlights have been misidentified. However, a lot of people have been able to kind of chalk this up and determine what they're seeing when they're further looking into some of these more stationary or man-made lights. I think they do add to the mystery when they kind of add to some of these light refraction theories, which I still think is pretty interesting concept of them maybe bouncing off something and causing the orb. But I think them being mistaken for the orbs and the lights themselves is, pretty easy to identify that misidentification.
Yeah, we speak a little bit with Dr. Caton about this kind of idea, and I think it is easy for some people, maybe especially if you've traveled a good long way to get to Brown Mountain because you've heard about this stuff. I think it's a little easy to get a little caught up in some of the ideas of like, here we are, there's illuminations happening on the mountains. What are we looking at? When these are areas that there's tons of people camping on. There are planes in the sky. There are cars that are driving around in the mountains. And, I've certainly been in instances where I saw something that looked a little strange and been like, holy crap, what am I looking at? And then, it ends up being something pretty commonplace, commercial aircraft or whatever.
Yeah, I've psyched myself up a few times before seeing it specifically kind of on the ridge, really around the Table Rock area. Like I've seen some pretty bright glowing lights, orbs, whatever you want to describe them as. However, I can't completely confirm without driving up to Table Rock from Wiseman 2 itself that those weren't just campers with some huge mag light type, flashlights or headlights even. So it's really easy to get yourself psyched up and kind of see what you want to see there. I think the common thing that I started to see is, I've seen some weird lights on the ridge, but I want to see them airborne before I really kind of convince myself of anything.
Well, I will say when the Lemur team was down there doing its big investigation that weekend that I spoke about previously, there was a gentleman that was with us that weekend who had a flashlight. And I mean, it's not a flashlight. I think they actually used them at certain points on the X-Files, but the diameter of the faceplate of this thing was, I would say, nearing, 9 inches in diameter. And it was a 1 million candle power flashlight.
Oh yeah, that could lead to some misidentifications for sure.
One of the tests that we were doing is he would stand in one area and he'd flash the thing so we could see from different vantage points what those illuminations would look like.
Yeah, kind of a control.
Exactly. If somebody had one of those and was using it at a campsite for some reason, I guess just a big flashlight enthusiast, at least we would have, and I think we filmed from these things, and we had, like you were saying, that control of, this is what an illumination of this magnitude is going to look like from these different vantage points on the mountains. So
Nice.
just
That's
something to take
smart.
into consideration.
Yeah, for sure. So, these explanations start to get more into the paranormal, supernatural explanations of sides. I think ghostly spirits is kind of the one that's tied to the early folklore. Some of those misattributed Cherokee legends really kind of feed into a lot of those ghost stories, but there's a ton of Appalachian folklore and ghost stories that came later on that kind of tied the lights to various different accounts that have happened allegedly throughout the area and tied them back to a ghostly spirit in some way.
Yeah. Cool stories, but, there's even less evidence about ghosts, so it's kind of hard to base one
Right.
theory, that's kind of hard to pin down on another one,
Yeah, one of the other ones that, I don't commonly hear a lot about is a bit of European folklore, and that's the will-o'-the-wisps.
Oh,
Have
yeah.
you heard that theory before?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, which are, they're basically said to be ghostly lights that are said to lure travelers into some form of danger. And some people believe Brown Mountain Lights could be a version of this.
That's another Pokemon.
I think it is, honestly.
All these fire types.
And of course, the UFO extraterrestrial theories, which really were fueled by Mr. Ralph Lale there. But, I think there's a lot of other activity in the area that have led people to believe there's some sort of a link. And, I mentioned this in the last episode. When you break it down by the technical definition, an unidentified flying object, when you see these lights hovering above the ridgeline like that, it's kind of exactly what it is.
Well, I mean,
Maybe not the traditional, glossary nuts and bolts craft definition, but still.
well, at its core, unidentified flying object was to specify just that, an unidentified flying object.
Yeah.
The alien spacecraft thing was something that culturally was just essentially attached to that.
Exactly, yeah. When I say UFO or unidentified flying object, a lot of people draw that parallel. I think they, are definitely quite different things within themselves.
Yeah, when I was on the Gralien Report show with Micah back in the day, I remember getting into a Twitter spat with somebody because I had said something about UFO, and he was like just going off on me about like, I can't believe that you're positing something about alien stuff. I was like, I never said alien. I said UFO, unidentified flying object.
Yeah, like that is a scientific term, a definition.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
I don't know. It's flying.
And it's unidentified, and I think it's an object. That part could be up for debate still.
True, yeah.
And I think we could round it out pretty nicely with some of the theories that suggest Brown Mountain and the lights themselves could be glimpses into some sort of window area or parallel dimension, if I do say so, where, the laws of physics kind of differ from what we're used to here within our own dimension. And I think there's, ideas about broader speculation of paranormal activity that could come from these portals. But I do think that that's a pretty interesting theory, also considering when these lights have been studied from so many scientific angles. Sometimes it's best to consider a new angle that might be outside of the current understanding of science.
Yeah, might as well throw something else at the wall, see what happens.
Yeah. So, Caleb, do you have any personal theories or ideas on the lights or opinions? Not saying that this is a put your foot in and solidify your opinion on that, but just, are there any ones that stand out the most to you that you kind of feel compelled to attach yourself to?
Yeah, I mean, well, let me just say that I can't definitively say that I know what they are.
Yeah.
The theories that I personally probably am going to lean towards the most is that, and again, I've got 1 foot in science, I've got 1 foot in the, paranormal pseudoscience or whatever you want to call it, just paranormal in general. But if I had to bet money on it, I would have to probably go with the theory that there is some sort of atmospheric phenomenon happen. Yeah. I think maybe the idea of a plasma or ball lightning phenomenon or ball lightning adjacent phenomenon, that one to me tends to make the most sense. I completely respect the standpoint that Dr. Greenfield has. And I think that if I understood the things that he understands about the occult and magic and practitioners of that and all of the stuff that he has spent years of his life looking into, that maybe my perspective would be more aligned with his. Yeah. But I always try to look at these situations with like, what could be the most probable
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
And atmospheric phenomenon to me just kind of seems like a little bit more.
Yeah, and we've seen that ball lightning theory come up almost time and time again. And I think there's one story we didn't really touch on, but it's almost called a close encounter situation with the lights. And I believe this happened at the 181 Overlook sometime in the 80s, where a group was going to observe the lights, and they basically described what was one of the lights floating up to them, and one of the people within their party touched his finger to the lights and basically experienced some sort of shock from that. And there were multiple people within that party that have confirmed that story. So that experience, and again, I'm no scientist. I don't know much, if anything, about ball lightning, but that description definitely seems like ball lightning could be a plausible explanation to it.
One of the stories that was always floating around back when I was with the lemur team was that there was somebody, and maybe it's this person that you mentioned in the story right now, but there was a person that had come in contact with the lights, had literally put, their hand up and got shocked, like felt a massive, massive jolt of electricity go through their body. And in the subsequent weeks after this occurrence took place, this person had a massive shift in their mood, their personality. If I'm not mistaken, I think the idea was that it was one of two situations, either this one or the vice versa of it, that they were kind of a, straight-laced business person. And in the weeks after this, they completely just lost interest in the corporate fiasco, and they, grew their hair out and, just became a little bit more in touch with the earth and some of the more earthy things. It was either that or the other way around. I don't know if the Brown Mountain Lights are out there making lawyers, but...
Yeah, that is interesting. That's definitely the same story, because there was a personality change described from what I understood with that, which, that's... not to relate too much back to UFO contactee stuff, but that's pretty common across a lot of those contactee stories too. You look at, we referenced Barney and Betty Hill on a previous episode, how they basically became obsessed after their own incident. It kind of dominated their personal life and interest and personalities moving forward.
There is a modicum of different effects that people have experienced after encountering UFOs that have been documented, and some of them are pretty horrific. Some of them are of the enlightening variety.
Yeah.
And I think that's a whole other can of worms to get into, because
sure.
The origin of some of the, burns, potential exposure to radiation that can come in the wake of a UFO encounter. I've never heard of anything specifically to that degree in correlation with reports of the Brown Mountain Lights.
Yeah, same here. I think that's probably the closest kind of up-close encounter that I could actually find, that's actually verified by multiple other people that were there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like that theory. I'm kind of with you on this. I honestly, I just don't know. I'm not a scientist, so really any attempt of an explanation from me would, at best be basically kind of a half-baked theory based on limited knowledge. So
what are we even doing here? Yeah. Why are we talking about it? Who are we?
So, with that being said, I do think there's a few common threads with some of these occurrences or sightings that do stand out to me. And I don't know if I could directly correlate them back to what I think the lights are, but I think there are some things that might be related. And who knows? Again, I'm no scientist. This is probably pseudoscience to anyone that understands these topics more in depth than I do. But I do think that there's, pretty compelling aspects to point towards the lights maybe being tied some way to Earth's electromagnetic field. There's potential with some of the geophysical makeups in the area with some of these minerals, granite, quartz that we talked about, which all have these electromagnetic properties and components to them already. And it really is kind of interesting to begin with to think about all these natural minerals and components of the geological makeup that could lead to something. But I think the U.S. Air Force report that we kind of referenced back to, where they referenced a bit of an interference or malfunction with some of their electric and magnetic navigation equipment in that specific area, kind of ties back to that theory. And, whether it's just drawing conclusions or just, making inferences for what could be basically chalked up to a coincidence, I'm not sure. But I still think that there's, a bit of a interesting enough coincidence, a meaningful enough coincidence to continue to kind of explore that thread a little more. Another potential possibility, I mentioned that night of the sighting where Joe and Jesse recorded what we consider basically the most significant footage of the lights to this day, was recorded on a full moon night. So, we know there's effects that the moon cycle has on the Earth's electromagnetic, field as it is. So maybe some of these fluctuations that are causing it could have something to do with it. Maybe it's even just a, refraction from the light of the full moon off some of these atmospheric effects. Who knows? Again, no scientist, but these are, some of the common things that I have noticed in some of this. And, the full moon theory is something that I noticed when I saw that video and something I've kind of tested on my own, trying to visit Wiseman's or the 181 overlook on some of these full moon nights. And one of the full moon nights in August, I believe, of this last year, did see something pretty interesting. And that's kind of what I consider the closest time to witnessing what could have been the Brown Mountain Lights.
Yeah, it almost kind of brings to mind this idea that if there were some sort of, let's say, almost invisible to the naked eye plasma thing that was forming, maybe it's dense enough to where it's not even, sometimes it can illuminate on its own, but sometimes it's not. And that moonlight is going through there and actually illuminating this faint plasma,
kind of refraction.
Exactly.
That was another thing I thought of. So at the end of the day, I'm just going to come back to the same conclusion. I really just don't know. I like the idea that there's, multiple overlapping phenomena in the area. I like the theory of ball lightning because I do think that from a scientific standpoint, that's probably one of the most sound. We just don't know enough about that to really have that be the cause of the lights. And I really do like Alan Greenfield's theory of an interdimensional portal, especially kind of given the high strangeness associated with the area. So, I do like to keep all aspects, possibilities open until proven otherwise. But one thing I do feel certain is that the Brown Mountain Lights are real, that they exist, and they still somewhat remain outside of our current understanding of science. And, maybe one day we'll have a definitive answer, but for now, mystery continues, and sort of like that sense of mystery and wonder associated with that.
You and me both. If nothing else, the Linville Gorge is an incredibly beautiful place, and I think it's some place that needs to be visited regardless of the existence of the Brown Mountain Lights. And, I also tend to agree that the Brown Mountain Lights, albeit they are more than likely extremely, extremely rare, I do tend to believe that there is some sort of occurrence going on down there because it's just something that has been reported for years and years and years. And, if it all ends up just being figments of everybody's imagination, well, at least we all spend a little bit more time in the mountains together.
The other theory is that they are tulpas created from Jules Verne's book.
Oh,
I don't want to get into that too much.
Wait, that's the one. That's the theory.
That was the initial theory I had, but I already used the tulpa one. So,
well, that's one that deserves a deep dive.
Maybe so. I think that episode's probably due up pretty soon.
Yep.
So without further ado, I think we're going to wrap up our talk here and get to our conversation with Dr. Dan Caton. That is, unless you have anything else to add, Caleb.
I will just say that I want to thank both Dr. Greenfield and Dr. Caton so very much for taking their time to be on the show with us. Austin, thank you so much for setting up those interviews, man.
Of course.
I think everybody is going to really enjoy both conversations. And the one thing that we wanted to provide for all of our listeners is we want to present the information so you can all form your own theory about what you think the Brown Mountain Lights are. And I think that both these, seasoned researchers bring their A game to the table with what they have, witnessed and experienced and collected through their data throughout the years. So yeah, I just hope everybody enjoys it. And I do genuinely hope that, Austin and I have put together what you may feel is a pretty damn comprehensive deep dive into the Brown Mountain Lights of potentially the likes that I don't know that I've quite seen before. And if somebody else did it before us and did it better, hey, rock and roll. But
I think after 5 hours, I would hope we have a pretty comprehensive report here.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Austin, I can't thank you enough for the work you do for this podcast. And dude, once again, you're just slaying it with the research. This has been your most monstrous research to date. And I thank you and appreciate you so much because, man, you make me sound better.
Well, I appreciate you being here to discuss all this with me. And again, you brought a lot of information to the table from these firsthand accounts you had with these lemur investigations. So, you brought a perspective that I don't think anyone else could have unless they were part of those firsthand.
And let me say what Austin really means. Caleb, thank you for sitting here and making fart jokes while I dish out the wisdom. No, man. I mean, I'm so glad that we were able to do this. And this puts the flag in the mountain, metaphorically, obviously, of us, hitting this peak of the 10 episode mark for goats in the mountains. It's a pretty peak episode for us, and it's very fitting that we have done this deep dive on Brown Mountain as we came to finally emerging from the cocoon and going into the double-digit episodes. So congratulations, buddy. We did the thing.
Cheers, buddy.
Cheers.
We made it.
Well, without further us talking a lot, ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy this interview with Dr. Dan Caton, and we will see you on the next episode of Ghosts in the Mountains. All right, everybody. Today we are joined by Dr. Dan Caton. He is a professor of physics and astronomy at Appalachian State University, where he has spent decades studying celestial phenomena. As an astrophysicist, he specializes in observational astronomy and is particularly known for his work on unexplained atmospheric lights, including the Brown Mountain Lights. Dr. Caton has taken a scientific approach to investigating the Brown Mountain Lights, deploying cameras and other instruments to monitor the area. He has explored various natural explanations for the phenomenon, such as atmospheric reflections, train headlights, and geological activity. And despite his skepticism of supernatural interpretations, Dr. Caton remains open to the study of the mystery with a rigorous scientific method. His work provides a valuable counterbalance to more paranormal-focused theories, ensuring that all possibilities are explored. So, Dr. Caton, thank you so much for talking with us today. And if you would, could you just tell us a little bit about how you got involved with researching the Brown Mountain Lights?
All right. Well, so I'm by training an astronomer and a physicist. And so when I moved to Boone in 1981, I heard some things about the Brown Mountain Lights, and I started a little file I threw things into, but I didn't really pursue it. And then, I don't know, a few years later, I had a student in intro astronomy claim that they had seen the lights from Wiseman's View and they had videoed them. So we went out during the day to get the lay of the land from the pulpits, the view, and what you see out there. And anyway, so then I started going out at night trying to see them. I never did get that video from him, by the way. He graduated, and I tried to track it down, and it just didn't work. I never saw that. But I've seen a lot of bad videos, so I don't need to see his probably. Anyway, so after a couple of years of working on that, then I got some University Research Council money to pursue the investigation with some equipment. I got a low light level Sony Handycam camera and a digital camera in the early days of digital cameras. And so I would take those out there and see what I could see. Then I was joined by my observatory engineer, Lee Hawkins, who would be helping me in and out over the years. And so we just weren't seeing anything. So we went out a lot of times, and basically it's an hour drive each way from Boone to any of the viewing locations. And so we wouldn't see anything, and it was getting kind of discouraging. And I met Joshua Warren on one of those trips. We went down to the 181 viewing area, Highway 181, and we were both part of the shoot of a documentary by, I think, the Travel Channel. I've done a few of these, so I may be wrong about that. I think it was Mysterious Journeys. And so both Joshua and I are on it, interviewed separately, and I looked at his video that he had on his Sony camera, same kind of camera I had. And at first take it looked interesting, but then what I was seeing looked vehicular. And there's like 27 miles of ATV trails in that area on that ridge. And those guys will drive at night. They're crazy. They'll do anything. So I also met another guy who had not seen it. And Joshua at that time admitted seeing it like once or 5 times in 100 trips. And then I met a photographer who was trying to capture them, and he hadn't seen them, but then he emailed me later or phoned me, I can't remember, and said he had finally seen them, and he was like 1 out of 20. So it looked like anything that was truly interesting was in the 5% range at best, which, so we want to pursue it. And then I got invited to this Brown Mountain Light Symposium they had down there in, or is it Morgantown, or I think so, somewhere down there. They held it down there, and it was a big, a weekend event, outdoorsy thing with all kinds of things related to lights and other things. And I was invited to give a talk, and Joshua was invited to give a talk. And I just kind of debunked a lot of his stuff to myself, and I was locked and loaded with my PowerPoint. And I began to feel a little bit bad about it. But then he gave his first, and I no longer felt bad. Like he was plotting the KP index and talking about these times of observation. And I thought, that's universal time on that axis. 0 is not midnight here. It's 7 p.m. daylight, 8 p.m. daylight, 7 p.m. Eastern. So he was totally out of whack with interpreting what he had seen. And plus he showed some video, supposedly through a low light level camera lens or binocular. And like he'd stuck his camera up to this thing. And he showed these red lights. Well, I've used these image intensifiers. They go back to Vietnam when they were developed for seeing the enemy in the dark in the infrared. And those have a phosphor that's only green. That's all they put out. You might have seen these videos of war times years ago.
Yeah.
That's because the eye has the greatest interpretation of shades of gray in the green. And so they don't bother with a red or blue phosphor. They're not color. And he was showing red, which I interpreted he was getting a reflected on the air light from the front of his camera. All these cameras, every camera has a little red light on the front.
Yeah.
Comes on when you're filming, so that whoever you're filming knows. And so I just kept with my explanation, and I mentioned some of those things. And then that's where I met a few local people, and we formed a research group, particularly a couple of industrial geologists. So some of the best, purest quartz on the planet comes from the spruce pine area. And so they were down there working for big companies. The Pyrex glass for the 200-inch Mount Palomar telescope was cast from quartz from there. And probably all of it now goes to the silicon chip industry. So anyway, and they debunked some things. There's no magnetite on that mountain, which he had claimed, and this, that, and the other. They knew what they were talking about. And I met an outdoorsman who runs adventure trips and so forth, even outside of North Carolina. And so we, Mike Fish-Etcher, and we formed a little group and decided to investigate them. I think it was Mike who knew a homeowner of a weekend house that overlooked Brown Mountain. And so we were able to repurpose some cameras that we had retired from astronomical use at the observatory to image the mountain. So we put a PC up in this little crow's nest room, actually through a door in the attic, put this computer in there and mounted the camera outside on the eave of his house. And we were using his internet at night when they weren't really using it. And we're using the upload side, which most people don't do anything with, really tap on a keyboard. That's nothing. So I would connect with my phone remotely to that computer every night and manually start that camera taking a sequence of time-lapse video, time-lapse exposures, hundreds of exposures. And then the next morning, and it was also pushing them to the university server. Next morning, I would take those and build a YouTube video. I wish there's SCADs out there. And so we started looking at those. Then we got another camera at a different location, another weekend homeowner looking north up the gorge for a different view. Then we decided to add a second camera at the first location because cameras have artifacts. So if you have two cameras, you see it in both cameras, then it's real. And so we got that running, another computer, another computer to start every night, the program. And so that's what we did. And we really didn't see a whole lot. We got excited about some things initially that we later determined were just noise, especially after we got camera 2 or camera 1B. And so we just weren't seeing anything at all. In July 16-17, that night of 2016, both cameras caught an anomaly that I really couldn't explain. It's about the only thing I've seen that's truly mysterious. It wasn't a clear night, but you could see this light appear and then disappear after a few seconds and reappear and disappear. I can't remember if it was moving laterally, but it wasn't moving up and down. So it wasn't a star, because stars during a 30-second exposure streak, that's the Earth's rotation. It wasn't a star and wasn't an airplane, unless the plane was not only flying toward us, but descending so that the altitude, as we perceive it, stayed the same. So it didn't go up or down, and then it went away. And I just done an interview with Mark Washburn of the Charlotte Observer. And I just said, well, I guess the lights are gone. We haven't seen anything. And I called up Mark and said, maybe we need to revise that. And I think they ran a little piece and it went viral. And at the beach, I'm at the beach by then for a vacation. And so I got these interviews I had to do, and I had to install apps on my phone to do these special interviews. And it just went crazy. And of course, the UFO nutcases got a hold of it, and then they took the ball and ran with it. And so that's about all we ever saw. And then the first home, the house had to be re-roofed. So we took our camera down and we haven't put it back. And then the other one we finally took down. And, on a couple of, reasons. One, was it Einstein who's claimed to have said, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result is insanity. And the other thing I thought, I'm wasting like 10 minutes of my time every morning and another 10 minutes in the evening, starting these things and then building a YouTube video and posting it. But worse, I'm wasting hundreds and sometimes thousands of people's time looking at something that's not, it's just garbage. And so I'm wasting other people's time. Well, it's worse than just wasting your own time. And so we just fell out of it, and we've tried to figure out other ways to study it, but it's almost an impossible thing to study. So our concept when we had the cameras was we're going to correlate the sightings with some kind of physical or meteorological or geological or electrostatic or magnetic thing that happened that night. And so we could say, now we'll know when we can go out and look for them with some better equipment. But we had nothing correlating. And so we were just at a dead end. Yet I think there is a real component. I don't even know if it's at the 5% level, though, of sightings. I think that there's something going on, because I got emails. I did 2 interviews, one for a Triad, a newspaper, and the next weekend with an AP reporter from the Triad. And those stories went out on the net. And I get emails from people who saw them or saw other lights, other places, but saw the lights there at Wiseman's View. And it's one thing to look across 1,000 feet of gorge and be confused by something you don't understand. It's another thing to see something 20 feet away in the parking lot. And one of our group's members' wife had previously, before our group formed, had been out on a girls' night out, Wiseman's View, and they were at one of the pulpits, and up comes this glowing glob. So clearly people have no reason to lie. They're seeing something they didn't understand. And I think that's when I theorized that it's possibly ball lightning, which has been documented for probably more than a century. It's been observed indoors and outdoors. We don't know how it happens. We don't know what it is. But it's another thing that's so random you can't plan to study it. There's no plan for the timing.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's about where we're at, and so I have no idea how to further make progress on it.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for sharing that background with us. I guess currently to this day, is ball lightning still your best theory on the phenomena?
I think it is. Oddly enough, many years before I got into this, we had an invited speaker come from UT Knoxville and Oak Ridge Labs. Mm-hmm. And he came over and gave a talk on ball lightning. And I remember he showed a film, and back then it may well have been Super 8 or some film technology. showed a film of an old experiment that used, I think, a bunch of submarine batteries, and they created this ball of glowing whatever, and it bounced on the lab table and then dissipated. When I did a special for National Geographic, they wanted another voice, and so I thought I would track that guy down. And I Googled around and found, well, good news is I know where he is. Bad news is the feds are picking which prison he's going to, because he had spun off a business doing surface plasma physics, which is related to whatever this is, and got a military contract and had spilled some secrets. And he had run out of appeals. So I think he's out now, but he was locked up. And so
Christine, that's
was the expert on ball lightning, and he's in the clinker. But we have 2 books in our library on ball lightning. One of them is by Kluwer, an academic publisher, and you can read that book. If you replace ball lightning by Brown Mountain Lights, the book would read fine. So it just seems like the explanation of physics that it could be going on. But then we don't know what ball lightning is, and there have been hit or miss attempts to make it in the lab. But how do you make a glowing ball of, I guess, gas that doesn't immediately dissipate by, just gas pressure, heated up plasma or whatever it is? It should just be gone. So how do you make something that's self-contained, survives for minutes? I don't know.
Yeah, it's also kind of weird too, because in a lot of cases that I had ever heard of people that had come in contact with the Brown Mountain Lights, there were all kinds of kind of extreme things that they experienced, personality changes and all sorts of things. And I was thinking, if you do look at the Brown Mountain Lights as being a phenomenon that either is or is adjacent with ball lightning, it's like that kind of almost made me think of electroshock therapy in some ways when people would come in contact with these high amounts. So I'm really not sure in that regard.
I don't know, but the trouble is what I've come to sum it up is, 95% of the sightings are natural or man-made lights. People are clueless about the nightscape. In fact, people are clueless about their environment in general. Here they are outside walking along, looking at their phone. They're totally disconnected from the environment. I see this on campus every day, and it's just disturbing.
Yeah.
They're not where they physically are, and they often have AirPods in, so they're listening to something. They're somewhere else on the planet, maybe 2 places. Their ears are one place, and then they're reading something or whatever somewhere else. And at night it's no better. And with light pollution and going indoors, watching TV and being online, most people don't have an idea what the nightscape looks like.
Well, I think a decent control for exactly what you're talking about there is a good scenario to look at is what was going on with the drones up in New Jersey. A vast, vast majority of what people were seeing were commercial airliners because they were doing exactly what you were talking about. They don't spend a lot of time looking at the sky.
Yeah, on one of those, I think maybe it was the second symposium. There were only ever 2, I think. One of them, Joshua arranged, or whoever it was, symposium arranged a couple of big trailway-sized buses to go out to a viewing. I think that was the second one. It was an awful time, like February, and it has snowed. Anyway, we're on board. We get out, and one lady was just enthralled with this flashing light. It was a radio tower light. Now, we've had airplanes and towers and required lights for a century, and you haven't ever noticed a cell phone tower light? Really? So what I tell people who contact me, they want to see the lights, and I tell them, well, real data is so sparse. There's no preferred time of the year, no preferred time of the night. There's not enough real data to correlate with anything. But what you need to do is first go to a location nearby, but not one of the viewing locations, maybe on the parkway, where you have a nighttime vista of rural lights, meteors, stars, just natural and man-made lights, and see what the nightscape looks like. Now go to one of these special locations and see if you see anything different. And we've been fooled too. I mean, Lee and I were fooled one night when we saw this light from Wiseman's View appear, and it rose up slowly, and it was really mysterious for a bit till it had a little lateral motion, and we could see it was a commercial aircraft. Probably still had its landing takeoff lights on for some unknown reason, probably coming from the DC area, something to the northeast, and it was coming straight at us. So, and slowly rising, it was getting closer, and this angle above the horizon is going to get higher, and then we could see it veer off in the flashing beacon light. In fact, I learned a lot when I did an interview for a special that I could mention in a minute with a documentary photographer from Asheville, and we've made a few trips out there. And the last one we did, I took my phone with an app called Plane Finder, and it's a free app, and you can hold it up, and it shows you all the flights in that direction, where they are.
Yep.
And there's a SCAD towards Charlotte. They're all down low because Charlotte's far away, but there's just all kinds of lights on the horizon. And so that resolved a few that we saw before.
Yeah, I've certainly experienced that same thing you're talking about when a commercial aircraft is angled essentially directly at you, and it does seem to look a bit anomalous. I'm assuming that throughout the years, with the Brown Mountain Lights being equated with a lot of like UFO accounts and people saying that they are UFOs, have you ever talked to anybody that you would consider, a credible source that has reported seeing something that they saw as a UFO or potentially some sort of high-tech aircraft that was, if not experimental government, potentially from, another planet or whatever?
I've not talked with them. I get a lot of emails like that, as you can imagine. There's one sitting in my inbox now. I haven't replied to. It came yesterday. It was very disturbing because they apparently spoke the whole damn message with Alexa. It's just this stream of consciousness with all kinds of misinterpretations of voice.
Yeah.
And I can't deal with it. And I've had other people email me pictures and movies, and I don't know how to interpret them. They're often poorly taken. It's a challenging thing to image. And I mean, UFOs, I used to argue and debate them with people who were real believers. Particularly, there's one down the Charlotte library system, and I somehow met online, and I argue with her all the time about them. And so we had this back a couple of decades ago. We had this bright meteor come over the eastern seaboard. It came, I think, north to south. It went over Deep Gap and went on past and down over to Charlotte. It was so slow that some citizen of Charlotte had time to run inside. I guess this was before smartphones. Run inside, get his camera, come back out and take a picture of it. And he gave it to the Charlotte Observer, but with the caveat that he did not want to be identified with it because he didn't want the UFO people to knock on his door. And that one, I got a call from CNN, Gary Turchin's show. Anderson Cooper 360, Gary Turchin or something like was a stringer for him. And he came up and interviewed me about it. And we talked about it. And they end up using the one line that I had previously used a zillion times. I said, it's one thing if a farmer out in Kansas, with all due respect, sees something he doesn't understand, go over it. That's one thing. But when it lands on the White House lawn and CNN is there, I'm in. We have all these reports and no actual encounters. And this is an age of smartphones when you could document anything. I tell my students about as close as we might have is there's a whatever you call it, a section in the Bible in Ezekiel that describes this rotating thing that it sounds like a UFO. And I said, Area 51 was a weather balloon. Just forget that other crap. It was a secret military thing they couldn't tell us about, and they shouldn't. And they're probably flying a lot of that now. And that's below the reports, and they can't tell us. They shouldn't, because then the enemy knows your ability.
That's a national security issue at that point.
And so
yeah.
I said, forget that. But if we back the time horizon up a couple thousand years, there's a greater chance we caught something. Something was seen, but before we had technology to record it. So I might give you Ezekiel. I won't give you Area 51.
Valid.
And I won't give you anything in the last decade or two, especially now with AI. It was bad enough with Photoshop and After Effects. You can make anything you want. on video or images, but now all bets are off on claims.
Yeah, and the wild thing about the AI is like we're essentially witnessing what it's capable of doing in its infancy, which is very impressive, and it's truly only going to get more realistic from there. So it's like if you feel like the waters are muddy now, just wait about a year and a half. It's going to get even crazier. So
It'd be interesting to ask ChatGPT about the Brown Mountain Lights.
yeah, I mean, I use ChatGPT all the time.
I haven't done them. But
Yeah.
it'll probably
Yeah,
send a summary.
right?
I want a 2-page paper on the Brown Mountain Lights.
Yeah. Not to jump back to Warren too much here, but you mentioned his theory about some of the looking at the KPI index. I think he had a lot of theories on some common atmospheric conditions that could lead to it, everything ranging from weather to geological factors to electromagnetic fields. You said that in your research, you haven't found any of those data points to be consistent.
Well, what are you talking about?
I think some of the factors he says for favorable conditions for viewing the light, such as going after a rain,
Right.
or in the fall month, something like that. Have you not found any kind of?
I've been there in bad conditions. I had I come up visit from Texas, where they have the Marfa lights,
Yeah.
James Bunnell, and we've traded emails over the years. He goes to Action Area, and we went and visited Wiseman's View in the absolute fog. I mean, you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you.
Fair
So
enough.
we've been there in that condition. One of the Brown Mountain Lights symposia that they took us to, I think we went to Wiseman's then. I don't know if it's at 181. We went to Wiseman's, I think, and it was right after a thunderstorm. And so there's a loose correlation at best, as described in those books on ball lightning, with ball lightning and thunderstorms. And I'm not talking about the things that you actually see created during a storm and blowing moves, just the normal view of an isolated thing. We didn't see anything that evening either. So having said that, though, a few times a week, I capture the last few days of the KP index. I capture that graphic and archive it, because if something's ever seen, I can go back and look, see how active the geomagnetic activity was. But it'd be nice if we could correlate it. And I don't think it would be unweaving the rainbow. There's some people don't want to explain; they want it to be a mystery. But it would be cool if we could predict when you could go and actually see it.
Yeah.
I mean, even if we understand it, there are lots of natural phenomena that we can predict when it's going to occur, and you can go out and plan to see it. Meteor showers, whatever, just cool things that happen, and we understand them. But we're not at that level of understanding yet.
Yeah.
Gotcha. I know you mentioned kind of comparing notes on the Marfa lights. Were there any common threads that you had seen between Brown Mountain and the phenomena experienced down with the Marfa lights?
I think that's a whole different thing.
Okay.
Recalling James' work, I mean, you're looking at a very hot, flat, Texas plain area, and he ran cameras too, but he ran it before the internet, and he had a digital camera and a digital VCR or whatever, hard drive recorder, and we'd make the few-hour drive each way once a week or two and swap drives, and then
Oh, gotcha.
watch that drive he brought back. And I don't know, he had some odd explanations I didn't really buy into. And other phenomena like, there's the piezoelectric effect, the wintergreen certs effect. You
Is
can
it?
take wintergreen certs and squeeze it in your teeth in the dark and it'll sparkle. Piezoelectric effect, same way your gas grill starts the flame. And but there's not enough geological activity in this region to do that. You just and that wouldn't be as energetic as the firework like displays that a lot of people claim to have seen. And so it's not energetic enough. And swamp gas, there is swamp gas on Round Mountain. One of our team has hiked up there and captured it with a little jar and lit it, but it's not enough. It's very low level at the wet areas. So,
Interesting.
so these other effects just don't seem to be it. But on the other hand, we shouldn't jump at one explanation. We've got a phenomenon seen by a lot of different people, different backgrounds and ability to discern things. So it could be a lot of different phenomena that are at different times interpreted as the lights. The bottom line is people go to one of the viewing locations to see the lights. They see some kind of lights, and they leave thinking they've seen the lights. I've seen people get excited by the distant lights at Lenore. Wiseman's view.
Yeah.
Other people, one night there was a group, I don't know, some kind of group. They actually had a kettle fire going back in the parking lot. And they actually, apparently, I never checked it, but I was told they had a fire truck out there, because if you're going to do that, you have to be ready. And
Yeah, no joke.
and they were taking pictures in the dark with their stupid flash on, and they were seeing things that they could only see in the flash. Well, we looked at it and we figured, well, yeah, what you're seeing is the ashes that we can't see in the dark floating over us, and your flash lights them.
Right.
It probably there are flashes that light bugs and other things that people don't see.
That is interesting.
No doubt. Well, a minute ago you were kind of talking about how, you wish that there were certain ways that we could potentially see the phenomenon occur a little bit more consistently. Right offhand, is there any emerging technology or some technology that would maybe just be a bit costly or something like that you think could be set up around Brown Mountain that could potentially measure this stuff? I mean, like electrostatic measuring equipment, if we are looking at it as being ball lightning, like, is there anything that you would, if you had like crazy government funding, what would you be doing on a technological
I don't
front?
know. That what our hope was when we started with our cameras, that we could correlate it with something. And then if we could get out and take spectra of it with a small telescope and a spectrograph, we could determine the kind of light source. Is it glowing gas? What is it? And if it were ball lightning and somehow the region preferentially made it, whereas you don't get it a lot of other places, then we could apply to DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency.
Yeah.
And it would bring us buckets of unaccounted for cash. We could convince, hey, this could be a weapon.
Sure.
And so then we could get big time funding. But that didn't play out. We were going to try to install a camera at Wiseman's View. I got money for the camera and the electronics. There's no power there. There's no utilities. So we were going to beam Wi-Fi to Lenore. You can send Wi-Fi a long way if you focus it. We had a big fish reflector dish, and you can send it 25 miles. We'd hope to send it to actually Google in Hickory or Lenore, I can't remember. You can see the Google facility from Wiseman's View, as if they're going to let you have a Wi-Fi signal into their inner sanctum. No, we would be outside the fence. But then we looked at it, we mocked up the base of the tower where we're going to put it up in the stand of dying pine trees up at the top. And I didn't realize that people have weddings up there. And we agreed, now this would look like crap. So we never pursued that. Just about a week ago, I recycled all that equipment because it's not going to happen. I don't know, but I don't buy into like Joshua's carrying ghost meters or whatever the heck those things are. I don't buy into that. You have to understand, you have to know the normal background in any signal you're looking at. And that's just beyond my expertise. You have to know what the normal electromagnetic field is like there all the time. And somewhere else it's similar, but not there. And so, that's beyond what I know how to do. I mean, you could do a lot of things if you had a lot of money and a lot of time. But this is, a back burner project. You're not exactly going to get tenure doing this.
Sure.
I do it. I've done it in the spirit of Carl Sagan, who's said that science has an obligation to investigate claims of the paranormal.
Yeah.
We have to sort it out. We can't just poo-poo it. We have to sort it out. It's been done for astrology. That's nonsense. And done for a number of other things. And so that's how I attacked it.
Yeah, Austin and I definitely tend to agree in that regard because, one of the reasons that we look into things that are paranormal or people report them to be paranormal in nature is because, and I think that this is true in any way that you look at science, is there are certainly things about science that are being revealed every single day that we did not know exist. And the other side of it too is kind of like what you were saying about the Brown Mountain Lights. There are so many people that report these things, and we both kind of look at it like, sometimes you're probably going to have to do some things that the scientific community would more than likely look at as being unconventional or just not worth a crap to actually try to, actually do. But, I am not a scientist, and therefore I have no problem with looking like kind of an idiot trying to apply some different things to this. But I've always thought, the world is still mysterious. There are still mysterious things that happen, and to just poo-poo that because we are science and we understand everything, it's like we know that we don't. So why take that mindset?
Well, a good example of that is, and may be related to the lights, is this phenomenon called sprites. These vertical discharges up into the clouds, and these apparently had been seen by pilots over the years, and nobody asked the scientists. And scientists aren't up in the cockpit looking forward, and nobody was catching them on sides at night. And so, in the last 10, 15 years, that's become a burgeoning area. And there's more than just sprites. There are other phenomena. I can't remember their names, atmospheric electrical discharge phenomena that have come out in the last decade or so.
Oh, yeah. I just recently saw some photos of what they call the red sprites, which I guess are just a version of the sprite or a different color variation. But I just saw an image of that for the first time ever, probably within the last year or two. So, I mean, maybe we are getting closer to being able to at least more frequently record stuff like ball lightning. But as you were saying before, these things happen so inconsistently. It's like you'd have to literally live on the side of the mountain there to actually be able to do decent research and not have a job other than that.
Yeah. So, the trouble is you can't plan when to go look, and going out there and a 2-hour round trip and staring into the dark for an hour or two. That's why we wanted the remote cameras. And so it's not a productive use of your time. And I just can't believe there's some people that claim they survive every time they go. Well, pretty clearly they're not. They're seeing something else.
They're seeing hikers or something else on the ridge or.
Oh yeah. I mean, one time Lee and I took a little telescope with us out to the pulpits there at Wiseman's and had this little 4-inch meter celestron aimed at Table Rock. And we could see campers around the fire. And some other people came down the trail there and they got all excited. And we said, come here. Look in the eyepiece. This is what you're seeing. And one time I was by myself and I saw what appeared odd, some lights looking towards Table Rock. But on my side, I saw some lights going down through the trees. And then later, the leaves fell off the trees and I could see those were taillights. Cars using the road past Wiseman's turn off.
Yeah.
So they were just going there. The only time I've really seen, other than that one we imaged, seen anything really odd, I drove down to the Asheville area for a day trip, and I came back in the evening. I thought, well, what the heck? I'm going by Wiseman's. There's no good route otherwise. So I went off to the viewpoint, and it was dark and nobody else around. I walked down there and watched for a while, and suddenly I noticed, about halfway up in the sky, appear a bright starlight thing. It wasn't moving, so it wasn't a satellite. I've seen a lot of satellites, more of Starlinks than I ever want to see, and that's a sad story. But that's another story. But it was as bright, it was brighter than any planet, brighter than Venus, and it just then went off. And I don't know what that was. Is that what people are seeing? I don't know. It wasn't a satellite, it had no lateral motion. And so there are these iridium satellites. I think there's still some up there that glint light.
Oh, yeah. I see them all the time.
Of course, the Starlinks are infamous now. I image those every night when I'm observing, every night in some images. And I only notice one of hundreds of images I remotely have the camera take on the telescope.
Yeah.
I just walk in the room with a computer and say, oh, there's one. And that used to never happen. So these are going to add to the UFO reports, I'm sure.
Well, it's pretty crazy to me how commonly and frequently Starlink gets misidentified even now. I mean, they've been in the sky. I mean, the first time I ever saw one, I was in an odd position because there was literally just a little hole in the clouds. And I kept seeing the things come by. So it looked like something stationary and spinning. And I'm like, oh boy, here we go. I was like, finally the sighting of a lifetime. But then I realized, kind of what they look in succession. But yeah, I mean, things that kind of come to mind as far as ways that I think that we could potentially, if we had a little bit of money and we were to, put some cameras back up, and maybe you had a system like this and I'm just misunderstanding, but I think that if we had an AI system that could sift through the hours of footage and then essentially, like, if there's movement, block that out and then put it into a concise, essentially like pile to review. You weren't using a system like that, or were you?
No, my system was to watch that stupid video.
Yeah.
Set up. Yeah. I imagine I could definitely see how the burnout set in after a while.
Yeah, I just watched that, but that was on a day that I saw that other weird thing and said, "Hey, Lee, look at this." A lot of problems with that because they're distant blinking traffic lights, and so sorting that out. I mean, it's already going to be a huge problem for some big time astronomy projects to sort out those, like the Vera Rubin telescope that's going to go into operation this year, going to image the entire sky from Chile that it can see repeatedly on about a 3-night time scale. Everything that appears, moves, changes is going to get discovered, and it's going to be pipelined, and software is going to find that stuff. I mean, that's not its main objective, but it's going to discover every minor planet that we haven't found, asteroids, killer asteroids, variable star, everything that changes. But now they've got these Starlink streaks, and they're so bright, the newer generation that Elon doesn't seem to be able to successfully launch because it's going to take a Starship. They're even bigger and brighter, and they're bright enough that they will create electronic alias streaks, parallel streaks across the image. So it's just going to be a can of worms.
Sure. Yeah, no doubt.
And so, yeah, but you could do that. There's software that will do that. There are smaller ground-based telescopes that look for supernovae and other galaxies.
Mm-hmm.
So these telescopes automatically during the night, they will image, I don't know how many, probably hundreds of galaxies. Each time they image one, they pull up an archived image of that galaxy, register the two, line them, subtract one from the other. If nothing is different, then just get a blank. But if something has happened or brightened or something, then you get a point there. And so it can automatically find supernovae and galaxies. And if it finds something that's smart enough, it goes back and redoes that one an hour later, because it's quite possible as an asteroid wandered into view. And if it's still there in that same place, then they'll wake up an astronomer. So that kind of software has been around for a while. But there we have a very controlled view. There's no street lights. It's pretty simple to do that.
Yeah, understood. I can see how it wouldn't completely eliminate the work, but at least makes the workload a little bit smaller for going back and reviewing some of those alleged anomalies. Yeah.
Heck yeah. Well, Austin, did you have any other questions you wanted to run by?
I think I covered most everything from my list.
Okay, awesome. Well, Dr. Caton, I just want to thank you very, very much for, spending your time talking to us fools about this stuff, because, it's something that both Austin and I have had a vested interest in for a long time. And I mean, I think that you are truly one of the few people on the planet that has actually taken a ton of time to really, really look at this and really dedicate themselves to, trying to figure out what this is. And, if you ever have any ideas about, we could try this, maybe somebody could do this, definitely shoot us an email and just, throw any ideas our way, because, we're just up in Asheville. We're down to make the trip because, like you were saying, I think that whatever it is, there is something going on, whether it's incredibly inconsistent or whatever. But, part of me kind of likes it. There is a bit of mystery around the mountain because it's like, something to work towards,
Yeah. I'll do a shameless, speaking of Asheville, I'll do a shameless bit of self-promotion.
Please, no, promote all you want.
Yeah. Yes.
I don't make anything off this, actually, but I didn't make it. So that documentarian that I worked with created a really great video and a show, and I went down to see initial private screening with me and the other two people who were featured in it. One of them is a guy who actually saw them on Brown Mountain, and the other is what's called a spiritualist. So there's all three kind of views.
Yeah.
And he did a great job of mixing this. And so we went down. I went down to Asheville and saw it in that quaint little theater in that arts district next to the river that got demolished.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of that little theater. But anyway, it was great. And it's now out on Amazon Prime. It's called I Saw the Light, or I Saw the Light. I can't remember. So your search on Amazon, the first three will be, was it Merle Haggard, or, it'll be that song. And then there we are down there. So
we'll put a link to that in the show notes for you.
Yeah, it's worth, I think it's worth watching. He did a very tasteful job of mixing three different viewpoints.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, is there, if you want to promote any website or contact info, or if you don't want people blowing up your email about this situation after all these years, is there any contact information you'd like to share?
You can always email me. So
yeah,
CatonDB at App State. So, yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
Be enough.
All right.
Well, thanks again for spending some time. And if you ever feel like talking about this stuff again, we are around. And like I said, please shoot us an email if you ever have any ideas about ways that we could potentially further investigate this thing.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much.
All right. You're welcome. Thank you.
Talk soon. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Caton.
Well, there you have it, everybody. An incredible interview with Dr. Dan Caton. And we just want to thank him once again for dedicating his time to talking to us about this phenomenon. And we just want to thank you, the listeners, for always tuning in to Ghosts in the Mountains. And if you want to learn more about what we do, go to ghostsinthemountains.com. You can also email us at ghostsinthemountains@gmail.com. And until next week, we will see you on the next episode of Ghosts in the Mountains.
The book also contains photographs of the alleged alien mummy from Ralph Lale.